to Lavada and Matt, who will be participating in this along with myself. And for those of you who are not familiar, my connection in terms of this overall story has to do with the fact that one of the co-founders of the Underground Railroad Education Center, or the Underground Railroad History Project, and we're a nonprofit organization, a community organization. It really grew out of the attempt by myself and my wife to understand the story of the Underground Railroad. Lots of people told us lots of things. This is like 22 years ago. And when we sat down to say, well, we wanted to answer the two questions: what was the local story of the Underground Railroad, and who were the African-American people who were involved locally? And this was a question we went around, we asked various people, and they basically told us there wasn't much to learn or nothing to know, or we should look at another community nearby. And being obedient students, we took what they gave us, but said, well, let's go read widely and see what we can learn. And as we read widely and began to find things, we began to find the bits and pieces of the answers to our questions. And we, at one point, when we had about 10 stories that we thought this is the answer to our questions, we thought maybe we should share that with a broader community. So this led to creation of walking tours that we did for a number of years. And we'll still do them by request. We had a couple in the past 6 months that we have done in downtown Albany, going to places where people who were involved in the Underground Railroad, abolitionists or freedom seekers, lived or worked or conducted their activities. And we go to those places and tell stories. And then shortly after the end of the first year, we organized a conference and have been doing that conference almost every year since that time. And shortly after organizing the conference, we organized a nonprofit organization in order to support the conference. But not long after we organized the nonprofit organization, we came across a flyer that said that the Underground Railroad, the Vigilance Committee of the Underground Railroad, had a headquarters at a particular address. And since we were all about where people lived or worked or had their activities, we had to find that address. And we found very quickly that Livingston Avenue used to be Lumber Street, and the address of 198 Lumber Street, although the numbers had shifted on the street, 194 Livingston was where 198 Lumber Street was. You know what I mean? So not long after that, we got involved with the Albany County Historical Association's, a collaboration, the Albany County Historical Association's youth archaeology program. And Matt Kirk actually was trying to think. I'm bad at names once people move away. So Corey McQuinn was the archaeologist who was kind of the lead person with that, and then later on Matt Kirk. And so we were doing that. We also had some work to get the Myers residence on the National Register of Historic Places, and so there was some archaeology involved with that. But basically, it was a very, they dug a few things, they found a few things. But then as time went on, I think we probably did about 10 years of these youth archaeology programs, principally not only around the Myers residence, but also a couple of lots down where Thomas Elkins, an African-American doctor, once lived. And so we were accumulating things that were tied into, the Thomas Elkins story and the Stephen and Harriet Myers story. So we, in 2017, we had a group from the State University of New York come and ask if they could do a summer project. They had actually been doing, in prior years, they've been doing projects going to Central America, studying Central American Native communities. But this year they decided they were going to do something local, and they decided they wanted to do something that was tied in not only with the Underground Railroad, but also with the Tenbrook Mansion property. So, so that summer we had students there, and it was amazing in the sense that this, you know, we had seen a bunch of years of youth archaeology and some very limited archaeology that was done by Hartgen in connection with, you know, getting the building on the National Register and whatnot. But this project with the students from State University was much more aggressive. I think they dug probably about 10 areas in the backyard of the Myers residence. One of the holes was 14 feet deep. And they discovered some things that were quite the surprise. Two outstanding things that I take away from that. I mean, there are many things, but two outstanding things. One is that the small tree immediately behind the Myers residence that I thought was sitting on top of a cistern was not. There was nothing under that tree, and there was a water cistern. It was about 8 or 10 feet farther north of where that tree was sitting, closer to the building, and a water cistern, a stone water cistern that was I don't know, maybe about 8 or 10 feet across and about 14 feet deep. And there was some additional piece that was set in the middle of it that we never did determine exactly what that was for, but I suspect it had something to do with pumping water out of the cistern and into the building. And there was a ton of stuff that came out of that cistern. Things that were certainly lots of things that were broken, but some things that were whole, which was quite a surprise to me. We have a couple of jugs that actually probably should have brought them along to show you. A couple of jugs that were unbroken, some bottles that were unbroken, and just a host of things. So what this archaeology has meant for us, together with the documents that we've been able to recover from various places, Anne-Marie Hess, who was on this call and who has been involved with the Underground Railroad Education Center, was working at the Albany County Hall of Records and was randomly assigned to clear up a box of old mortgage documents. And since she'd been volunteering with us, she spotted names that she recognized. So John Johnson, Abram Johnson, certainly Stephen Myers and Thomas Elkins, William Henry Johnson, and also I'm missing one that I want to call to you, and I can't think of it right now. But so Lydia and Abigail Mott, yeah, the Mott sisters, and so you know she was able to get color copies of these. And so we have them on display at the Myers residence. And they're fascinating documents. They're not all mortgages. In one case, it's a bill of sale for John and Abram Johnson purchasing a boat in the early 1830s. And so that again adds to the story of Abram Johnson and John Johnson in terms of African Americans who are working the river trades in the region. So together, those documents, we have some other documents, the archaeological materials that we found, they help us get a better understanding of the life of people who lived in that building and also in the residence where Thomas Elkins lived. But they also, you know, give us a better flavor, another dimension of the story, and it's been extremely fascinating. So I'm going to leave my part of that there, and I guess we're going to go to Matt next. And Matt, you have some slides, so we'll make you a co-host. Great. See if you can find it.
So while we do this, maybe I could just set up the story here a little bit. In that Paul's right, there's been a tremendous amount of archaeology that's been accomplished in and around the Stephen and Harriet Myers house in Albany. But we've also recently conducted some archaeological investigations a little further afield, up in Florence, Oneida County. And I just wanted to present a short slideshow of some of that recent work and how it's informed us about how far-reaching some of the efforts that Stephen and Harriet Myers were involved in. Am I able to do that? Am I able to do that now, Paul?
Yep, go for it.
Let's see. Can you all see that?
Nothing yet.
No.
There you go.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay, good. So just by way of some background here, Florence is located in the very northwestern corner of Oneida County, and I've got some slides to show that, hopefully. So we're dealing with an area that's northwest of the city of Rome and northwest of Utica. And today, this portion of Florence is mostly within state forest land that was obtained by the DEC and the State Forest Service in the 1920s and the 1930s, after much of this land was no longer productive for agricultural use, and it was purchased to set aside specifically for the timber and the lumber that could be harvested from these properties. So this is the Florence settlement was conceived of as this sort of utopian community in which recently free people of color in primarily Albany, but also extended out to New Bedford, Massachusetts, were invited to set up farmsteads. And the person most directly responsible for this idea of creating a new rural Black community was Stephen Myers. And he was working very closely with Gerrit Smith, and you may be familiar with Gerrit Smith from his work at Timbuktu up in the Adirondacks. That was a sister community that was ongoing at about the same time as Florence, about 1849. Gerrit Smith was exceptionally wealthy. He was very engaged with abolitionist efforts, and he owned quite a bit of property, both in the Adirondacks and Oneida County. In Oneida County, his property was being managed by this gentleman, G.D. Dorrance, or Durrance, I think is how Paul pronounces it. And he was working more directly with Stephen Myers than Gerrit Smith, per se. The other person involved in our story is one of the major abolitionists of the day, was Frederick Douglass. And what's interesting about Stephen Myers and Frederick Douglass was both were publishing newspapers at about the time that the Florence settlement was being developed. And Stephen Myers' newspaper was known as the Northern Star and Freeman's Advocate. He also was involved with the Pioneer in the late 1840s and 1850s. And for a period of time, when the Florence settlement was ongoing, there was a short run of newspapers called the Florence Telegraph and Temperance Journal, 1853 to 1855. The reason I call this to your attention is that the fact that both of these gentlemen were publishing newspapers led to a certain amount of tension between the two. And this actually plays out in the newspapers during the day, and I think has somewhat of an effect on the ultimate success or lack of success that was enjoyed at the Florence settlement. So in about 1847, Stephen Myers holds a convention for emigrating into the West. And by the West, he's meaning western part of New York. And he's out and about throughout all of New York State and New England, trying to elicit both people who are willing to emigrate to this new farming community, but also for funds and equipment for other people to help with the endeavor. A couple years later, Frederick Douglass starts to express some doubts about the enterprise, and I'll talk a little bit about this in the coming slides here. But Stephen Myers presses on, and by 1849, he's starting to get a number of different families to move from their original locations and to resettle up in Florence. And so by the summer of 1849, you get the first cohort of settlers. I mean, the idea here was to have literally hundreds and hundreds of families relocate to this part of Oneida County. But in the end, as you'll see, it was probably less than about 25 that actually made significant progress and stayed for any real length of time. There was some measure of success that could be kind of gleaned from the newspapers of the day, and one of them was in September of 1853, when there's the announcement of a marriage of Henry Simmons and Mary McCoy, and these were two people who had moved separately to Florence, but then found themselves together and married and started their own family there. The newspapers also suggest by the fall of 1853, Myers, who had been living or at least commuting fairly regularly to Florence, is now back in his Albany home. And there's little record of him actually returning back to Florence after about 1853. And by 1854, we have really good records that suggest a large number of the remaining settlers to Florence had already left. And this might be of interest to Sarah, who I think was on earlier from Canada. We have the Reverend Walter Hawkins, who was living in Florence, and he moved up to Ontario and actually started a church, the British Episcopal Church, up in Canada. And he specifically, we'll get back to Reverend Hawkins later, but he specifically mentions in some of his memoirs why he left Florence, and this will be an important part of the story. So as I mentioned, Stephen Myers traveled quite frequently in the years before the Florence settlement was open for operation. And through his own words, he says, everywhere great obstacles oppose our improvement and elevation. Law, public sentiment, and popular religion unite to crush the colored man. We see it and feel it in our souls. We are determined to have a change. Ourselves must strike the blow. We must inform and strengthen ourselves with knowledge, go into the occupation of life around us with intelligence and confidence. And part of what he's advocating for is a self-sufficient community of primarily Black farmers, but also Black mechanics who could mill their own lumber, produce their own nails, so that they would have the materials to build their own houses and to literally create their own financial community that they could thrive in. As I mentioned, Frederick Douglass was not necessarily was initially in favor of the idea of the settlement, but there was a number of different elements to what Stephen Myers had proposed that gave Frederick Douglass some pause to the whole thing. And by February of 1849, Frederick Douglass states, "I find the Florence village is all humbug and will doubtless do great injury to the anti-slavery cause if it is not exposed. And I hope that you will not allow your name to be associated with it." And so one of the main, I think, obstacles to winning over the support of Frederick Douglass was the fact that Stephen Myers was selling the property to potential residents. And both Frederick Douglass and, as we'll see here, Garrett Smith both had hoped that Stephen Myers would essentially gift the property to the various settlers. Now, from my reading of the documents, Stephen Myers was not offering these parcels, even though they were fairly small, at any outrageous price. And I'm not really sure what the real issues were here at play, but I don't think it was really the fact that they were being sold at these really fairly modest prices to folks. It could have been more the fact that this was a rather isolated community, well away from transportation networks. There was also issue with the fact that this was not very productive agricultural land. And within the larger context of New York State history, in 1850, New York State had, like the rest of the nation, had just come out of a great economic depression from the Panic of 1839. Land prices had collapsed for a period of time, but then by 1850, land prices had spiked again. And in particular, agricultural property was exceptionally valuable because scientific agriculture had started to make a great deal of surplus for farmers, even on relatively modest and small lots of land. But even still, despite this, I think Frederick Douglass and Garrett Smith had hoped that the settlement would have been located on more fertile lands. I mentioned earlier that the sister settlement was occurring at about the same time at Timbuktu. And as you're likely aware, this settlement also was not very successful in the end. Obviously, in the Adirondacks, the land was not very fertile either. It was difficult to work. You had a slow, short growing season. And by 1855, that settlement had largely fallen apart. Although I think it's interesting to me that Timbuktu is sort of a larger entity in the public consciousness, even though, as you'll see, the Florence settlement, many of the residents stayed there for a longer period of time than what had occurred at Timbuktu. So what happens here at Florence? Why is both Timbuktu and Florence not ultimately as successful as all of those who had supported the endeavor had hoped? And really, a lot of that laid well outside the hands of the people involved, and it was due to forces that were being propagated at the federal level, with the both passage and later strengthening of the Federal Fugitive Aid Slave Act. And the way that I think about this in my own mind is that here you have a rural community of Black people who are primarily engaged in farming. And you have basically slave catchers out looking to capture and to return to the South, or just to take back to the South, never having actually been in the South previously. People who would have been relatively strong, relatively young, and had some knowledge of working on a farm. And that seems to me to be the people who were trying to be enlisted to settle here at both Florence and Timbuktu. And I don't think it was much of a stretch. And in fact, as I mentioned, Walter Hawkins directly states this, that after 1852 or so, he became fearful that he was going to be captured and taken into slavery in the South. And so these settlements slowly dissolve, especially being abandoned by the youngest and strongest of the bunch. And what you're left with are older families, smaller families, or families without many children. And so the weight of the community sort of collapses in on itself. So just quickly to get through some of the archaeology, this has been accomplished with a cooperative effort of both the Underground Railroad History Project, the DEC, who now manages the land. We've been in a partnership with the Camden Central School District and some high school students who are part of the American History program there. We've worked with the Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission, as well as folks from the New York State Museum and other places. And we've been engaged with the process about 4 or 5 years, and we only do this one day out of each year or so. So we don't have a lot of time invested, but I think we've got some really interesting results so far. So the process is working with volunteers who come out to walk over the areas that are now part of the state land where the Farm and Florence settlement was once situated. There are portions of the Florence settlement that are also on private land, and we're trying to arrange access so that we'll be able to look at those properties in the future. It involves raking and clearing of the surface features that we've encountered. We've even done some metal detecting. Unfortunately, we can't collect any of the material because this is on state land and it would require a state permit to do that. I'm looking into working with various universities to see if they would house a collection, or at least to help us to catalog a collection, so that we might be able to do some excavation and collection of metal detecting in the future. But we were basically using this as a remote sensing technique to find log cabins and other settlements. The students were also helping us with mapping and sketching and documentation, as well as photography. In particular, this feature is actually not directly associated with the Florence settlement. A number of the farms after about 1860 were bought up by later Irish immigrant families to Oneida County, and they stayed on for the next 30 or 40 years before their farms eventually failed as well and were purchased up by the state. So what we have is these palimpsests, or different layers of occupation that have occurred here. So we have both the Black farming settlement and this later Irish farming community sort of overlapping each other. And so part of the process is us trying to map and document each feature as best we can, so we can start to tease apart what features, like this barn ruins, were part of which occupation on these various sites and lots. So if we look at some of the census records from the time, we get some insights into exactly who was living in the Florence settlement. And in particular, we found archaeological remains associated with the Joseph Young's family, and the William Brown family, and George Washington's family. Joseph Young's, we know from historical records, was occupying a log cabin along one of the roads at the Florence settlement. He was originally from the French West Indies, and he married his wife Marie, who was also from Canada, the Cape Breton area up in Nova Scotia. This was an older family. They were 60 years old by the time that they had emigrated to Florence, which is really quite old. And so their tenancy at Florence was not very long. And they remained there from about 1850 or so. And we know by 1872 that Joseph Young's had left Florence and or passed away, and had sold his property to Thomas Reynolds, who was an Irish laborer on a nearby farm. I know it doesn't look like much on your screen, but there's actually a stone platform that it appears that Joseph Young had built his log cabin on. And I suspect that there's a fairly rich archaeological deposit associated with the farmstead based on the metal detecting hits that we got in and around it. So this would be a place where I think future excavations would be really profitable. I mentioned George Washington. He had his wife and 2 fairly young children living on the farm, and they stayed well past 1855. They were still in Florence up until about 1860, and then by about 1865 and the start of the Civil War, I lose track of George Washington and his family. I've had some indications that he may have fled to Canada as well, as George Washington shows up in Hamilton, Ontario in about 1870 or so, who was born in Pennsylvania. But it's not entirely clear to me that it's the same individual, but there is some small amount of evidence that he like Walter Hawkins, left Florence and went north. Even by 1860, there seems to be about 27 or so of what was originally probably closer to 100 original settlements to Florence who are still living in and around the initial settlement. Here we have George Washington's farmhouse foundation. This was later occupied by an Irish family. So again, part of the process here is trying to disentangle what was part of George Washington's original farmhouse and settlement, and what was occupied, and what was part of that later occupation. We know a little bit about what George Washington was doing on his farm in Florence based on historical census data. He had a really small, modest farm of only about 13 improved acres. And at the time, most farmers, self-sufficient farmers, had about 50 acres, 50 to 100 acres. There was another 38 unimproved, which he was probably timbering, selling the resulting logs to nearby mills, or perhaps burning the logs for potash and pearl ash and selling that. There were no horses. He had 1 cow, 2 oxen, and no sheep. So it was really, again, a small, self-sufficient farm. Some of the other archaeological evidence associated with the farm, where there's this really interesting stone-lined well, which was located just off of his house to the west. Another story that I wanted to talk about today was that of William Brown, and I think it's fairly appropriate that we talk about William Brown today because it's Veterans Day. I know a little bit about William Brown based on John Young's deed of gift. And at the time that John Young's purchased his property, the deed suggests that the corner of his lot is next to W.T. Brown's 5 acres. Now that's a really small lot too. So if I go back to that other slide, if I can, we know something about where William T. Brown's farmstead should have been located. And we've found some evidence of what appears to be a structure and perhaps a well in that location. But we don't have a clear indication of exactly where the house may have been. According to the 1865 census, William Brown is listed as a cook, and he, like George Washington, was from Pennsylvania, and his wife as well was from Canada. At 47 years old, he enlisted as a private in the U.S. 26th Regiment of Colored Troops. And so based on that little scrap of information, I kept digging a little bit more into a little bit of the history of William T. Brown. And it turns out he re-enlisted again after his first tour. And eventually he ended up in an artillery company. And according to the Civil War records, he entered as a private, but left as a sergeant. So moving up the ranks during his time, especially in 1864, when, according to the record, he was put on special duty. And according to the records, Company C of the 16th Artillery, the Black enlisted soldiers of that company were put to work at a very specific task. And they were asked to help build what was known as the Dutch Gap Canal as a way to circumvent some large heavy artillery installations that the Confederacy had built. And there's a remarkable set of photographs of the troops who are engaged in this activity. And I just think it's really neat to kind of look at these and to wonder if any of them are actually William T. Brown. So I'm just going to flip through a couple of these and let you take a look at what the experience of being a soldier at this time may have been like for William Brown. The irony of Williams Brown's service is he was due what was known as a bounty or a cash payment at the end of his service. And unfortunately, according to the historical records, he was denied the cash record because of a small clerical error in some of his paperwork. So he lost out on over $300, which would have been a pretty remarkable sum at the time, due to problems with his paperwork. He seems to have remained at the Florence settlement after the Civil War for a short period of time, as he's listed in the 1870 census, working a farm about 41 acres. But by the time that this map that I have on was made in about 1872 or 1873, he's already left the area and gone elsewhere. And I'm still tracking on where he might have relocated to. But the blue arrow at the top of the slide there at the map shows just about where his farm should have been. And by this time, there's only a couple remaining of the original Black settlers in the area, including the Lawrence farm and the Simmons farm on that map. So one of the few records that we have of what life was like at Florence is found in a later biography that was written about Reverend Walter Hopkins and his relocation into Canada and the development of the British Episcopal Church of Canada. And it's fairly interesting to read talking about how difficult life was, what it was like to clear the land, to make it habitable. But in the end, he clearly states that it was because of the Fugitive Slave Act and his fear of being captured that drove him from the settlement and into Canada. Before the project started, there was no indication that there was anything like a settlement or any farmsteads in this area whatsoever. And through the work of Jessica Harney at the Camden Central School District High School there, she was able to apply for a Pomeroy Foundation historical marker, and one has been recently installed at the site. Aside from that, it's pretty easy to walk through this area without having any indication that this was at one time an up and coming settlement that was really important to the history of New York. We're hoping to continue to work with the DEC, both to manage the archaeological resources, to find ways that people could visit, and also to find ways to highlight the archaeological resources that are there. That's what I have.
Thank you, Matt.
Sure.
That's fantastic. Lavada?
Hi, let me just get all back to seeing folks. Mainly for me, in supporting Paul and Matt, I just wanted to share just some thoughts on, one, the settlements, but also the place of archaeology. I read, over my career time, a lot of archaeological reports, but in coming to the State Parks Department and working at the Resource Center, I've been very fortunate to have literally archaeologists right under my feet. And I've learned so much. And one of the things that Matt and Mike Lucas at the State Museum have shown me is the lack of public awareness of archaeological remains connected to Black history. So I'm really glad that a marker was put there, and that people have an opportunity to go out and see, because this is a way for us to physically connect to our heritage in a way that nothing else can. One of the things that when you spoke about why people are kind of into Timbuktu, I think that has a lot to do with marketing. I think that has a lot to do with the push of John Brown Lives and their enthusiasm about Timbuktu. But I also think that overall, many people are just not aware of Garrett Smith's gift of this land and the arbitrariness of how he did it, right? Like he just took a map and just drew some lines and said, okay, I'm going to give this chunk of land away without himself really understanding what that land was like. And when I think about particularly people who are not accustomed to the cold of the Adirondacks or the cold of New York, once you get north, being willing to go into such wilderness and to try to craft the life and create a life. But also that impact of the fugitive slave law had on people who had been living in plain sight in New York for a very long time. Having to say, no, you know, a lot of people were free, but a lot of people were not. And then that forcing them into Canada or forcing them to flee for that fear of being taken. One of the challenges I think that we have is how do we, and this is my big thing these days, how do we get from that information, that archaeological material culture reports stuff into the hands of the public? There's so much misinformation still around the Underground Railroad. There's so much of our state's history that people still don't know regarding African-American history. And the Underground Railroad, we have this myth, I think that many of us learned in school, right? That, you know, slavery was connected to the South and New York was a place where everybody fled and that it was this easy walk through New York. It was just like you got on a train and you just went. Most people that from the South that come to visit me, because I'm originally from Texas. So when I have a house in Peekskill and even living up here in Albany and going north, most of my family and friends that come here are floored that it's so mountainous. So when we talk about a Black community in the Adirondacks and not making it, oh, I so get that. But that is a vital part of our history because it is about people wanting to try, wanting to have their own place, wanting to have community around them and control of their lives in a way that even in prosperous urban environments like New Bedford or like New York City or Albany or anywhere, they didn't really have. That there's a level of ability to relax that they didn't have because there was a lot of racism in New York coming out of, in the New Nation period, coming out of the slave years here. There was a lot of adjustment. And then as we were trying to make those changes through the Civil War years and post-Civil War years, there's also that contention that comes in when the Irish come in. And Blacks are really being pushed out of jobs and being pushed out of locations. So there's a lot of cultural impact that we just don't talk about. But I learned more, I have to say, Matt, about Florence. But in all of there were more settlements. There's through that area that just people, a lot of people took that land and never showed up. You know, they wanted to do that, but the unpreparedness of Garrett Smith or others to help fund this change, to give people who really did not have any experience as farmers to go into really one of the roughest areas of our state, was probably the less fertile soil that we have anywhere. But it was also interesting to learn about that whole exchange between Frederick Douglass and Stephen Myers. You know, don't connect my name to this because this is what I'm hearing, right? But what he was hearing was true, right? What he was hearing was true. And for Garrett Smith to then say, yeah, the land is thin, it's not as fertile, it's not as supportive. It's like you want to do a good thing, but you're almost setting people up for failure. Mm-hmm. And trying to do a good thing, you're setting people up for failure. But an amazing project. And I think definitely that whole Garrett Smith gift of land, those whole exchanges, and all of those settlements are a book waiting to happen, guys. And I'm not writing it.
Well, we've certainly run our hour-ish time. Probably if we certainly have an opportunity for a little bit of discussion as well. So if I just there was just one comment in the chat, and it really was mentioning that Walter Hawkins said, I guess, moved to Ontario later. But I don't know if does anybody else have anything they would like to share or contribute in the course of this discussion?
I had a question. I don't know if I should type it or if I can just ask it.
Just go ahead and ask it, Yvonne.
Okay. It has to do with the fact that Frederick Douglass and Stephen Myers didn't quite see eye to eye on the validity or the sustainability of this settlement. I noticed also that there was some mention about a separate newspaper called the Northern Star, and
Right.
if there was any tension because Douglass had a paper called the North Star. I didn't know, you know, and also I was wondering if, because Frederick Douglass became so well known, if there might not have been a little bit of an ego clash. You know, that, you know how the spotlight tends to focus on one person, and that can, you know, maybe lead to a little bit of underlying tension.
Sure. I mean, I think that, you know, these folks are human beings. There's little doubt in my mind that there was some ego issues as far as Frederick Douglass was concerned. But on the other hand, and definitely, you know, the two of them having newspapers, just to mention the Northern Star and Freeman's Advocate started in 1842. The North Star, I think, was what, 1849 or 47, much later. But this idea of the North Star was
Right.
a widely used image among the abolitionist community. So, but you know, so they had newspapers that to a certain degree were competing. The other thing is, and Amy Godine had brought this up, and I know she was working on a book. I don't know what's ever happened to it, but I had some conversations with her, and she was mentioning that one of the things that happened for people in the 19th century was that they had this image of what a man was, you know, and a man had to be a farmer, and he had to be, you know, the expectations for a farmer was that he had to have at least, I think, 50 acres, a minimum of land, in order to make a go of it. You know, so what Stephen Myers was doing was selling, what, I think a quarter-acre plots, something like that, in a kind of clustered, with the expectation that people were going to farm somewhere adjacent to this in common to some degree. And this was a model that was being used in Canada, and a model that was used at the that one settlement that was so famous, the Dawn, I think the Dawn settlement at any rate. And this was the direction that he seemed to be going in. And because he wasn't offering people 50 acres of land, and he was offering these smaller things, the thought was that he must be swindling. There must be something wrong here. There must be some underhanded something going on where he's cheating people. And that was the concern that was coming from Durrance. And then, of course, Durrance communicating to Garrett Smith. So the tension was there. Tension was there. And then you had the fugitive slave law, you know, which I think ultimately drove most people away.
But also, Paul, I have to, and I don't know about the whole 50 acres thing, but the swindling is probably a real concern. But also when this project was first put out, it was heavily touted. And I think people really thought they were selling fertile, clean, rich land that was not rock filled, that was not, that you had, all this lumber. Yeah, you had the lumber. Yeah, that's the one thing the Adirondacks got. But you cannot dig a hole and not hit rock.
Yeah.
So I think that the whole concept of what is a farm, I think that there's this whole misunderstanding of New York topography that was never discussed.
Yeah, that's real.
So when this is put out, when all of this is put out, this is really pushed from a very positive standpoint. And then people go there, they check it out, they see reality, and they're going back, and word of mouth is killing this project. And word of mouth is saying, oh, this is thin land, it's a lot of rock, you're nowhere near a town. I mean, really, the Adirondacks is wilderness now. It was definitely wilderness
Right.
then,
Yeah.
right?
Florence is a little bit better than, I think, than the Adirondacks, but still, I think those challenges, as you point out, were there.
Yeah, but many of the people who applied for the land were also coming from urban environments.
Right.
So even though Florence is better situated than many places, you have people coming out of cities. You have people coming out of good-sized towns. So that easy access to other things, easy access to other towns, easy access to other communities. Really, I think that reality in itself played into these settlements, because even Myers, he goes there, he's only there a couple of years, man. So maybe he even has to rethink his original plan, rethink his original idea, even after he has tried to live there.
Yeah.
That it's not all what he thought.
Yeah. Matt, do you have any observations on that, or?
Yvonne, your question is great, and I think it really does hit to the heart of the abolitionist movements were not monolithic, right? There's really great political complexity to the whole movement. And I think that's largely kind of either forgotten about or sort of papered over these days. And I think that kind of scholarship is really warranted to get into, these kinds of political complexities. And I'm not aware of that kind of, rigorous research into the different currents that were going on between what we would consider the major players in the movements of the time. And Paul, can I just draw your attention? I don't know if you see that Nolan has a really great question that he has in the chat box, if you wouldn't mind, maybe.
Sure. Nolan, let's see. Nolan mentions thinking about the broader interpretation of both Florence and Timbuktu, how may we deal with the fact that heritage material culture here is limited and largely intangible? What do you all envision as a dream project that shares the connection between these sites with the broader public beyond a Pomeroy marker?
Well, one thing that's happening with that now is there is a gentleman who did a film on Timbuktu, and some of the research, and that is being shown, I believe, tomorrow night for the first time.
Yes, at the SUNY
Albany Writers Group.
Yeah, at I want to say Milne Hall, the downtown campus.
Yeah, the last one they did both virtual and live, so that may be on. So I think that there is a lot of still trying to get the information out about them.
About 7 o'clock, I think that is. The other thing is, I mean, obviously, from the standpoint of historic houses and historic sites, I mean, there's a handful, literally upstate, handful of sites that of a similar character to the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence. I'm trying to remember the names of some of the sites, but there's a site over in Massachusetts, and I can't recall the name, but it was one of the chaplains from the U.S. colored troops was there, and there are a few other sites scattered around. So that's a new horizon for people. A historic site that is rooted in an African American story. It's hard even to communicate to people that this is we say it's about the Underground Railroad, and people assume it's about Harriet Tubman, and so we're trying to tell a story that's important to the Underground Railroad story, but that people aren't perceiving necessarily. So that's a challenge for the Stephen and Harriet Myers residents, and I imagine that there's also a lot of stuff. And this is one of the things that I find a great frustration here in the city of Albany. There are a lot of useful, interesting, intriguing, and fascinating historical stories that are tied to properties that story is invisible to people. Nobody has articulated a research on it, whatever. So and so we see these buildings and see them being torn down, and it's just sort of like there's only so much you can do. It's like we're struggling to complete the restoration work on the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence, let alone get to these other things. So that's a frustration.
There was a
challenge. Yeah, go ahead.
A preservation project that happened in, I think, around Philly, where they were doing memorials for empty lots, places where buildings had been. That even though the building physically is still gone, the stories are there, the research are there, like who were these people who lived there? And so there's a way of grasping that in intangible history. But what I'm finding the biggest challenge for any of my dream projects is just the lack of people for all of the projects, because the research takes time. And in many of the instances, particularly here in New York, when we are still dealing with a dearth of printed books on Black history. I mean, and as you say, it's not Harriet Tubman, right? I mean, how many statues, another statue, not to negate the positiveness of it, but another statue of Sojourner Truth has gone up. So we keep going back to the same folks,
right.
Those popular names, when their work was supported by so many others that we never hear about and no one ever investigates. Like this whole connection into Southern Canada. There's a lot of information there. There's a lot of richness there. And what happens is some of those families move back. That's barely touched work.
Right.
So my dream project is to have just more people involved so we can get more stuff printed.
Right.
I have to sign off now. I have something else coming up, but thank you so very much for the presentation. It was fascinating and really reinforces the role that New York State has played in this whole historical drama. So much history across the state that it's really fascinating. And thank you very much for the presentation.
So yeah, maybe we would close it up at this point. Matt, Lavada, do you have a last word?
Thanks for sharing your afternoon with us.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. Thanks, Matt. I learned a lot.
Thanks, everybody. And we really appreciate it. Once again, this was recorded, so it will be available. I think Zoom sends out a note to you automatically saying that the recording will be up for the week following, and we may have it up in another place as well. So thanks again. Thanks very much. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Matt. And
thank you.
Thanks everybody for being here.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Lavada.
It was great. Thank you.